Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Nichola Raihani. Her new book is The Social Instinct: How Cooperation Shaped the World. Nichola Raihani is the Royal Society University Research Fellow and Professor in Evolution and Behavior at University College London, where she leads the Social Evolution and Behavior Lab. An evolutionary biologist by training, she won the 2018 Philip Leverhulme Prize in Psychology for her research achievements and was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Biology. She's also worked in the BBC Science Development Team and appeared on several podcasts and radio shows, including the BBC Radio 4's Hacking the Unconscious and Thought Cages. She lives in London with her family, where we were able to peel off 2 hours of a super interesting conversation, despite the fact that our kids are downstairs. We're all doing this under COVID pandemic conditions still. So we talk about that, how well we've done in this pandemic in terms of cooperation. She's not that encouraged by how the fact is we're still dealing with this now a year and a half later. Anyway, so we talk about the origins of cooperation, how that could have possibly come about in a selfish gene model, and show the logic behind cooperation all the way back to the origins of life, all the way up to nation states and last week, essentially. The origins of empathy and altruism and kindness, along with the negative emotions and aggression and violence and what the evolutionary origins of that would be. We talk about morality and to what extent we are moral beings with the moral emotions and how those would have evolved, again, as part of cooperation. We talk about individual selection versus group selection, which is kind of a technical debate in evolutionary theory circles, but interesting nonetheless. We talk about why humans developed to be such cooperative creatures, but not the great apes, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and so forth. You know, what set our species apart, and that led to a discussion of the so-called natural family that conservatives like to talk about, that is anything but, actually, in terms of our evolutionary history. We're very cooperative breeders, as she says. That is to say, mothers get a lot of help, not just from the fathers, but also from their own siblings and extended family, parents, grandparents, and so on. And then we end up kind of talking about the human lifespan and why and how that's tied to this notion of the necessity for grandparents, but not beyond that. And so that kind of leads us then to wrap up at the end and talk about to what extent she's rationally optimistic about the future of our ability to cooperate to solve big problems like this. Because the dark side of cooperation is we're also very have a lot of in-group amity and out-group enmity, and so this cooperative tendency we have can also backfire as we push back against other groups that are cooperative themselves, but not necessarily to our benefit. Anyway, super interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening. All right, so Nichola Raihani, this is your new book, The Social Instinct. I'll have already properly introduced it, How Cooperation Shaped the World. I'm going to start us off with what I often do with some of my guests, particularly those who are Darwin fans, with what I call Darwin's dictum, which is that all observation must be for or against some view, if it is to be of any service. So this comes from a letter he wrote to a friend of his named Henry Fawcett in 1861. Fawcett had attended the British Association for the Advancement of Science conference that was highly critical of Darwin's new theory on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And there was complaint that he was too theoretical and he should just put the facts before them like a good naturalist should do and let the facts speak for themselves. So here's what Darwin wrote back to Fawcett. About 30 years ago, there was much talk that geologists ought only to observe and not theorize. And I well remember someone saying that at this rate, a man might as well go into a gravel pit and count the pebbles and describe the colors. How odd it is that anyone should not see that all observation must be for or against some view, if it is to be of any service. So I've always kind of held that up because I think as a principle, because all of us authors, whether we're pretending to be purely objective and have no agenda against any other authors or theories or anything, that's nonsense. Of course, we all have some kind of a point of view, or what's the point of writing a book? So tell us what your book, The Social Instinct, what's the point of view it is for or against?
So thanks for that introduction. So my book is about how social life evolves and how cooperation evolves on this earth. And it takes an explicitly Darwinian perspective to try to address this puzzling question of why we ever see costly helping behavior in nature. Because, of course, that costly helping behavior is somewhat at odds with a very narrow reading of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, which typically, or if you read it in a very narrow sense, tends to emphasize competition. Phrases like survival of the fittest start to spring to mind, and nature red in tooth and claw. So if we have all these ideas that individuals are sort of relentlessly competing with one another for limited resources, then the fact that we see so much cooperation in the world around us starts to look like a bit of a puzzle. And in fact, it's a puzzle that we can entirely reconcile with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And in some sense, that's what my book is about.
Right. Here's how I described it when I was trying to summarize this problem in my book, The Moral Arc. A cell or body or organism, a survival machine, is the gene's way of surviving and perpetuating itself. The problem is that survival machines scurrying around in, say, a liquid environment like an ocean or pond will bump into other survival machines, all of whom are competing for the same limited resources. And then I quote Richard Dawkins, from which this language comes. Quote, to a survival machine, another survival machine, which is not its own child or another close relative, is part of its environment, like a rock or a river or a lump of food. But there's a difference between a survival machine and a rock. A survival machine is inclined to hit back if exploited. This is because it too is a machine that holds its immortal genes in trust for the future, and it too will stop at nothing to preserve them. All right, so that's the problem. So how do evolutionary theorists like yourself get around
passage.
That? Yeah.
So I love the passage, and it brings to mind for me a phrase that I read in a paper a while ago, a paper that was written by an evolutionary biologist called Sergei Gavrilets. He's a theoretical biologist. And he had a paper, he wrote a paper that was exploring why we see cooperation in nature. And one of the key insights that I think makes it really intuitive to understand is that once you have some of these, what you might call survival machines in your parlance, once you have some of these survival machines that team up, that form teams, there's no rational alternative rather than to join a team yourself. Because you simply, if you're a lone entity and you're competing against teams of these survival machines, you just can't compete. And maybe a more intuitive way of thinking about that as well is, in the UK, we've just had a very big football, or what I guess you guys call soccer competition, which was the Euros, and England were knocked out in the final on penalties. But one of the kind of almost like a universal rule in soccer is that if one team has a man sent off, if they're playing with 10 men instead of 11 men, it's just so much more difficult to win the game. And that also shows this kind of intuitive logic of cooperation, that once you have teams, and once those teams, one team is larger or better than another, it's very difficult for a less cooperative or a smaller team to prosper in competition against the sort of bigger one, or the more united one.
Yes, well, my wife is from Cologne, Germany, but for some peculiar reason, she's a huge England football fan. She was rooting for England to beat Germany, which they did. And anyway, then of course, as you can imagine, she was pretty disappointed in that final minute of the shootout. Yeah, but actually, soccer fans is another good example of the sort of darker side of cooperation, right? We're united together, but boy, they can sure get united against other groups. So, I mean, you kind of end the book with that darker side of cooperation we have to watch out for. But just kind of walk us through the kind of nuance of when it's good to be a good group member versus, you want to take care of your own kin and kind.
So when we try to understand how cooperation evolves, we are confronted with this inherent tension, which is the one that you've already articulated, which is that at its heart, cooperation is a means by which entities, whether they are genes or cells or whole organisms, it's a means by which these entities improve their position in the world. It's a means by which they increase their fitness, as evolutionary biologists would put it. And because cooperation is inherently, at its heart, a competitive thing to do, what we can often see how this plays out in nature is that cooperation and conflict often go hand in hand. And there's no, I mean, I describe this in some respects. One way of thinking about this that I describe in my book is to think of cooperation can often have victims. And we see that either in our own bodies. For example, sometimes some cells in our bodies start doing their own thing and they start pursuing their own individual interest. And when that happens, we call the disease that results from it cancer. And we can see that those cells inside us are doing their own thing. They're now pursuing their own individual agenda at the expense of the host organism. And sometimes they actually form little teams as well. They form little cancerous communities, if you like, inside your body that help one another to evade the host organism's defenses and to try to hijack all the resource delivery and nutrient delivery for their own ends. So this kind of provides a nice example, I think, of how sometimes, you know, we see ourselves as this kind of feat of cooperation, this collective. We're collectives, we're made up of genes and cells, and we are, on the whole, a unified front. But there's always the potential for conflict to occur. And sometimes that conflict can arise actually from cooperation that's occurring at different levels of complexity or different scales, evolutionary scales.
Yeah, I dove into that literature on cancer of what you just described in the 90s when my mother got meningioma brain tumor. I mean, she just started acting really weird, and so anyway, we eventually got a brain scan, and here's this massive meningioma tumor pressing half her hemisphere back. So anyway, we had it removed, and then 2 popped up, and I'm like, what the hell is this? And then they had the 2 resected, and then 4 popped up. So then I found the literature of Jonah Faulkner at Harvard Medical Research, like in the 60s, I think. He postulated that tumors secrete an angiogenesis chemical to draw blood vessels to them to feed them, but they also secrete an anti-angiogenesis chemical to prevent other tumors from growing. So it was almost like a Darwinian competition inside a body between tumors. And so that's when he developed this idea, well, if we can extract what the anti-angiogenesis chemicals are, then we can treat tumors like this. And that had some success, but not, it's way more complicated than that. But I got to thinking about that with dictators, right? You know, like we toppled Saddam Hussein. Well, that's good because he was one badass dude. But then there were like 10 badass dudes who replaced him. And it's like, oh, that's actually maybe even worse, right? So there you have that tension between cooperation and competition.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really interesting perspective that you raised about your mother's cancer, because that's slightly, in some ways, that's actually a really interesting version of this kind of playing out of cooperation and competition, where you've basically got one tumor that's acting to suppress all the other tumors, and once you remove that one tumor, then the others will pop up. And sometimes what you can also have in these cancerous situations is that the tumors actually will work together. And, you know, for example, they're called subclones. So you'll have a subclone of one variety that really specializes on producing, helping to hijack the blood flow or to produce more blood vessels that bring blood to the tumor. And then a different subclone, say, call it subclone B, can make use of that thing, that resource that the first one is providing, and it does something else that benefits subclone A, and they kind of have these mutualistic arrangement, if you like, and I think it offers some really interesting potentials for thinking about targeting cancer, because potentially some of the most effective ways to target cancer, like you said, is to take this evolutionary perspective and to think about, and you said in some cases it might be about targeting these pathways that bring or prevent the blood supply from coming to other tumors. In other cases, it might be a case of actually disrupting the cooperative partnerships between the different cancer subclones, such that they can't work together and they're not as effective at, hijacking the host's body, essentially. And I think those perspectives are just starting to come through now they're becoming more mainstream, let's put it like that, in the cancer world. But I think it's taken quite a long time to really appreciate that evolutionary biology could have something to offer in this space, as it has in a lot of evolutionary medicine, actually.
Yeah, the Judah Faulkner story was interesting because he was a surgeon and he had a hard time getting the attention of, medical theoreticians or researchers, because it's like, what does this guy know? He's just a surgeon. They're like mechanics, right? And so that was an interesting sociology of science, how that kind of works, who you listen to as an expert. So let's apply what you just said to the current crisis we're going through with the pandemic and COVID-19, which now we've had a resurgence here. Yesterday, the governor just closed, or the mayor of Los Angeles just put it back on masks because of the Delta variant and so on. So COVID has kind of evolved in a way that Ebola didn't. So here, Ebola is too deadly. So people die too quick before they can spread the disease around the world. But COVID seemed to have struck the right balance of keeping patients alive long enough to spread. So just talk about diseases like that, since we're going through this from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously evolution has no foresight, right? So evolution can't sort of sit there and tinker around and think, what can I do to make the most easily transmissible disease that's going to spread around the planet? But if it could, I think it couldn't come up with something much better than COVID-19, because, like you said, it has a long asymptomatic period where you can transmit the disease. It's relatively, even though millions and millions of people have died, the mortality is not that high. So it's not as high as something like Ebola, or actually a lot of the other acute respiratory viruses like MERS and SARS, which had much higher mortality, which actually, like you said, stops those diseases or the viruses that cause those diseases from being able to hop from one host to the next, because they are too virulent. They're too damaging to their current host, and they don't get a chance to spread around as in the way that COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 has managed to. And I think that it's, in some respects, I don't know how to say this, but in some respects, I guess my sense is that this has been a pretty good. We're going to have more pandemics. Like, that's a fact. We know we are interfering in the natural world to an extent that it's almost inevitable that something like this or a disease like this will crop up again, and it will probably be in my lifetime. If I'm lucky, it will be one more, right? So in some respects, I think we've been lucky is not the word I want to use, but I think this is a trial run, and hopefully we can learn from this experience that we've all gone through. We're dealing with a virus that we could have had a virus, for example, that had a long asymptomatic transmission period, but was really deadly, and that would have been much more damaging for human population around the world than COVID has been. And so, I guess the main thing I would hope is that we can learn something from this, and we can learn what strategies we need to employ, how we need to actually take human behavior into consideration when we're thinking about how to deal with pandemic spread, and how much of that actually is to do with social behavior. I mean, it sounds obvious to say it now, but I think that we came to that realization quite late in this current situation, that some of the ways we were going to have to change people's behavior were going to need us to understand social behavior and what makes people behave in a certain way, and how can we try to encourage them to do this thing that's going to protect them and or protect other people and things like this.
Yeah, I don't know if you know Michelle Gelfin's research on tight versus loose cultures, and how tighter cultures that citizens are more likely to obey the law and pay attention to experts like medical researchers and so on when they say wear masks or get vaccinated, tight culture people are more likely to do that. She has some data showing difference, say, between Germany and Italy or the United States or Japan and the United States and so on. So you have a whole section on this, on individualistic cultures versus more collectivist cultures. But in fact, if I recall, you had collectivist cultures are not necessarily always better in that regard because they can be more xenophobic against other groups.
Yeah, so one of, in the context of COVID-19, actually, I wrote a paper with a colleague of mine who is a political psychologist at Cambridge University. His name's Lee DeWitt. And we were building on this established finding that shows that political conservatism is associated with having a relatively smaller scope of moral regard relative to political liberalism. So basically what that means is that if you imagine yourself stood in a circle and all the people on the planet, including your friends, your family, your colleagues, and then strangers and people you don't know, they're all stood somewhere. You're the center of that circle, and the close people to you are stood closer to you, and then the people you don't know and live in other countries, they're kind of quite far away. And this scope of moral regard sort of describes where people draw that circle around themselves, which determines who you feel you ought to, who do you have a moral obligation to, who are you expected to care about, who are you expected to help if the need arises, and where are these moral obligations, where do they begin and where do they end? And a very general pattern is that political conservatism is associated with prioritizing friends and family, essentially. So you help your friends and family a lot, but you don't feel that you have the same moral obligation to help people that are not in that circle that you've drawn, that are outside that circle. Political liberalism, on the other hand, is more associated with drawing a bigger circle, whereby maybe you don't feel that you have to offer as much help to your nearest and dearest, but you correspondingly do feel this weight of moral obligation to help complete strangers and kind of anyone really that in society. So we took this as a springboard and asked people how worried, this was right at the start of the pandemic, before, when things was just starting to ramp up and things were getting, it was obvious this was going to be a serious thing. It was in April 2020. And we asked people, how concerned are you about the COVID-19 pandemic? And we asked them to specify their concern at 3 different scales. So we asked them to tell us how concerned they were for themselves, how concerned they were for their friends and family, and how concerned they were for society in general. And what we found is that when we looked at how people's political affiliation, for example, if they identify as politically conservative or politically liberal, affected the concern they felt at this global societal scale, we found that predicted pattern that the people that felt were more politically conservative reported feeling basically less concerned about the impacts for society, even though they were very concerned about their friends and family, in fact. So it's not that there's a political divide in how much people care. It's just this kind of, where do you draw the line? Who am I obliged to care about? Who do I have to think about? And I think this sort of where we draw the line as individuals in our societies can be, I think, the source of some of the most profound political disagreements that we have in our current societies, because it isn't just about what do you think about COVID-19. It also pertains to questions about nationalism and immigration and social welfare and, all the things that kind of where these political fault lines are drawn. This scope of moral regard question maps onto those things to some extent. And so I think that will be something really important for us to try to get to grips with and to understand why people have those different scopes of moral regard and how we can try to bring people more into alignment with one another, whichever of those 2 things is the preferable. And I'm not going to say that one thing is better than the other here, but clearly when people are misaligned on those issues, there's a massive scope for that political conflict, essentially, and polarization.
But given that we lived in these tiny groups for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years as primates. The idea of like bringing total strangers into your moral sphere and deciding to treat them with equal benefits as you would your own kin and kind, that would be pretty abnormal. I mean, I tell the story about Jared Diamond, who's a good friend of mine, and you know, he got into anthropology from when he was doing ornithology in Papua New Guinea, and so he and his guide are hiking down some single track trail in the middle of nowhere, and they come across some stranger, and Jared's like, "Oh, let's go over and say hi," and his guide is like, "Are you out of your mind? I mean, we have no idea who this guy is. You don't just walk up to total strangers and shake their hand." Well, we would here, right? So. In other words, so by nature, it seems like that kind of conservative worldview, if we want to talk about it, that seems more natural, and that the liberal worldview is something more artificial that we've kind of instituted with larger societies. That, you know, we really do have a moral obligation to take care of people who are not our kin and kind. They're not part of our group, but they need help. You know, the people that are in oppressive regimes around the world, something like that. And so, but what I want to ask you is, you know, do you think people that are like that by nature, just there's natural variation in temperament and personality and so on, they migrate to more conservative or more liberal political parties, depending on what country you're in, or do they join these parties for some other reason, and the sort of the tenets of the party get inculcated into their worldview, and then they adopt this, you know, sort of tighter restrictions on immigration and things like that?
So I think this is another case where the COVID-19 pandemic actually had the potential to teach us something about ourselves. And I actually think that these differences in how we experience, you know, different scopes of moral obligation are not actually something which are fully ingrained in us or fully, you know, there from birth, if you like, or something like that. But I think they're really sensitive to the environmental conditions that we are experiencing in the moment. And one of the things that this kind of idea of keep things close, you know, invest a lot in your nearest and dearest, the people that you really rely on to help you, invest a lot in those relationships, and don't worry so much about strangers and people that you've never met. That kind of worldview is very much predicated on being exposed to what we call low material security. That basically means like having an inability to meet your basic needs, to be able to have reliably get food, and you know that you don't have to worry about food coming in. You've got a secure living arrangement. You feel like your health is okay, and basically having all these worries taken care of is what we call having high material security. And when people experience high material security, they can afford to relax a bit in terms of their social relationships, and they don't have to rely so much on this core circle of highly interdependent interaction partners to make sure that they meet their daily needs, or their you know, the needs that they experience over time. And this happened to us all with COVID-19. Like when the pandemic first hit, and I think this was kind of a general pattern that we saw happening in lots of places, where everybody experienced a reduction in material security. We were all suddenly worried about what would happen to our health. Would we be able to get food? Was there going to be any toilet paper left in the supermarket when I went there? Pasta, you know, you name it. It was like, we were worried we couldn't get the stuff we needed. All, you know, no matter if you had money in the bank or not, it doesn't matter. Some stuff was very hard to get hold of. And what we saw in the wake of that kind of material security shock in lots of places was a resurgence of hyperlocal cooperation. These things like mutual aid groups were springing up in neighborhoods. And, you know, for many people, it was the first time in London, where I lived at the time, it was the first time people had even spoken to their neighbors. They'd never met them before. And so I think it's quite interesting to think about how these kind of disparities in in the security people experience in their daily lives and their material security can actually then affect their view of the world and the way that they feel that where their moral obligations ought to lie, and how, you know, how they ought to distribute the cooperation that they're going to do with people in their social world. And, in some ways it's entirely rational, I think, that if you know that you're going to rely heavily on a few key partners or a few key relationships, that you do prioritize those relationships because you need to, essentially. And it's only when you don't need to, when you have that high material security, that you can afford to start taking more risks and cooperating with strangers and being, pro-social towards individuals that you've never met and that you might never meet again and things like this. And so there's abundant evidence for these patterns, not just in the wake of COVID-19, but also historically. If you look at the prevalence of food sharing, for example, in human societies, food sharing is a thing that we have always done as humans, but now it would seem so weird for me to go to the supermarket, buy some food, and then go and leave it on my neighbor's doorstep. Like, she would think I was insane. But we used to do this, and it's something we don't really do anymore because we don't need to. But I know she's got money in the bank. She knows I have money in the bank, and it would be strange if I shared food with her. But when we look at the prevalence of food sharing across non-industrial societies, what you see is a similar pattern, which is that once people can get control of their own finances, or they can smooth the peaks and troughs in their own food supply by themselves, then the prevalence of food sharing tends to drop and individuals become self-sufficient. And that's kind of a precursor in some respects to the rise of this kind of Western democracy model, where actually you don't rely on your friends and family that much, but you do care a lot about people you've never really met and society and things like that.
Yeah, the food sharing thing, we often think of our hunter-gatherer ancestors as being egalitarian. These are so-called egalitarian communities or bands. But Christopher Bohm makes the point that, well, you actually have to have a lot of kind of rules and standards and even punishment systems to make it work, because people by nature don't really want to share. It's just that everybody is pretty much dirt poor, so we have to kind of share. And so if the big man on the hunt, if he doesn't share, then we're going to punish him, right? And so again, back to this nature of human nature, there's a tension between, well, I want to take care of myself and my group, my kin and kind, and you want the same thing. And I know that you want that. And I know that you know that I know that you want that. So I have to do this kind of calculation in my head. How much can I get away with being a little on the selfish side? Maybe on the dangerous hunt, I kind of drop back just a little bit, so I'm not at the high risk front group trying to kill the animal that doesn't want to die or whatever. But my other group members can see that I'm, lagging behind a little bit. It's like, hey, Shermer, get up here, right? So, there's social pressure, and so again, that tension is always there. And those norms evolve along those lines. There's a couple things I thought of when you were talking. First of all, you make the point in that chapter in your book about this kind of a conservative caring more about your family, but nepotism is the darker side of that, right? Because conservatives tend to promote this meritocracy. People should be rewarded for their hard work and creativity and the merits. No special favors for people, unless it's my son and my son-in-law and my daughter-in-law who I'm going to appoint in cabinet positions in my administration, like Trump did. Again, not maybe he's not a real conservative, but that tension just keeps rising there.
I suppose, when you said that, I immediately thought of our government and thought, well, there's been so many corruption scandals and so many accusations of nepotism and cronyism and, contracts for mates and things like that in our current very conservative government, that I'm not that sure that actually meritocracy is necessarily one of the really lauded principles in a conservative government, at least not the government that we have, I don't think at the moment. But I think you're right that these, these words that we say, like nepotism, corruption, cronyism, all these words kind of, to people in the West at least, they have a very negative connotation, and we don't normally think of them as being examples of cooperation. But of course, they are examples of cooperation. Nepotism is helping your family. Corruption is maybe, forming a relationship with someone else, a friend, or doing some, having some kind of cooperative relationship that gets something benefits to both parties. The main reason we don't think of them as cooperation is that, of course, they create costs at a societal level. And But it's exactly, in some ways, the analogy with the cancer cells is really appropriate here, because what we see with the cancer is that there is cooperation happening. It's just at a level which it's bad for the host organism. So we don't think of it as cooperation, because in our minds, I think we think always that cooperation is this good thing that we want to promote. But, cooperation can have victims, and it often does have victims. And probably one of the big challenges for us as a species is to figure out ways to cooperate and generate global benefits in doing it, and not just keep those benefits at a local scale, because where the costs are maybe felt globally, because that's difficult for us to do. I don't think we're very good at that, actually. And I wonder if we really can do it.
Yes, I think it takes a lot of social technology to make people really want to cooperate. You talked about the expanding sphere. I think of Circle, Peter Singer's expanding circle. He wants to include animals. But just to get people to include other people is difficult. This research on the diminishing effects of how many people you present that need help to potential donors, the more people, the less money they give. But if you show them one person who's in need, people are more likely to get behind that. I call this the Endugu Effect. There was a film called About Schmidt. Jack Nicholson played this retired insurance salesman person or whatever. And he goes on a road trip in retirement, and he's channel surfing one night, and he comes across one of these adopt a child infomercials. And the little boy's name is Endugu, and he's, okay, I'm going to send $100 a month, and I'm adopting little Endugu. And so the narrative arc of this film is that he's writing all these letters to Endugu, telling him, how stressful his life is driving around America, and the motorhome breaks down. His daughter is marrying some nincompoop he can't stand. All the kind of first world problems. Of course, little Endugu is like 6. He's not even reading these letters, right? But in a way, it's sort of tricking the brain into making little Endugu an honorary member of my family, because I care about him. And after that, I adopted this little girl in Romania. And I distinctly remember they sent me this little package, like, here's her picture, here's her family, here she is with her soccer ball, and she likes to play soccer with her friend. And I actually started thinking, I really care about this little girl, right? But if you show me a picture of 1,000 starving kids in Rwanda, I'm like, what am I going to do?
Yeah, well, there's the famous saying, isn't it? One victim is a tragedy and 1 million victims is a statistic, or something like that. So, and it's this very well-known effect in psychology, in that, charitable organizations use to very, very great effect to try to prompt people to donate, which we call the identifiable victim effect. And it's this idea that if there's a single identifiable victim that you show to people and you say this individual needs help, that's very, very much more effective at prompting people to give or to do what they can than showing them the true scale of the problem. And I don't think we fully understand yet, or let's say like this, the reasons for it there are multiple reasons why the identifiable victim exists. One reason is that people generally like to have impact when they help. They like to feel like they're doing something and they are solving a problem, they're getting towards solving a problem. And I think if you show people the true scale of what is wrong, you can just quickly feel like it's, what's the point? It's hopeless. Nothing I can do can make a difference here. So partly there is an effect of this in wanting to make an impact. Another thing that's going on that with clever experimental work that's been done by a guy called George Lowenstein, who's done lots of work in this space, is this feeling of responsibility, this idea that, okay, well, if I don't help this individual, who will help them? And they did this with a really clever experiment, actually, where they went round a shopping mall in the States, and they had an iPad. And it was a bit like what you've said. It was sponsoring children by buying school books for them. And what they did was they had the kids color-coded. So they would approach somebody, a shopper in the mall, and say, we're looking for you, we want you to donate X amount of money to buy this child some school books. Here are the children, here are the one we've assigned to you. The previous ones, the ones that have been marked with green, they're the ones that we got a donor for. And the ones that are marked with red, they're the ones where we approached somebody and they said no. So basically that kid has missed their chance now. We're on to the next one. And when you present the decision like that to somebody, when you say to them, we're only going to ask you if you will help this child, and if you say no, it'll be red and we'll be on to the next child, it's really effective at making people give. And, intuitively you feel probably like, yeah, I would, why would you not? You couldn't not give in that situation. But there is this element of responsibility that's also comes into explaining the identifiable victim effect as well.
That is super interesting. Tell us about that experiment with the wallets. They dropped like 17,000 wallets. They must have gotten some good funding to do that, because they all had, each of the wallets had money on it. I guess the test was to see who would return the wallets in which cities, and then I guess they dissected those by, their tight or loose cultures or political orientation or whatever.
Yeah, so it was an amazing experiment. I think it was published either 2019 or last year. And like you said, they dropped around 17,000 wallets in loads and loads of different cities and countries around the world. And actually the wallets also had money in them. So the question was, would people be more likely to return the wallets or when they had money, or would they be more likely to keep them? And what they found was a result which, they had some wallets which had money and some wallets which didn't have money. And the kind of rational economist view is that, you should expect fewer returns when the wallets have money in them. And they actually found the opposite effect, that people were more likely to return the wallet when it had money in it. And there was also the thing that I was interested in that study was that there was a lot of cross-cultural variation in whether the wallets were returned. And like you said, that variation mapped onto these broad-scale patterns in what we call individualism and collectivism, which are also very much linked to these scope of moral regard that I was talking about earlier. And what they found in the study is that in more collectivist cultures, where the onus is on help your friends and family, but there are not really that many moral obligations to other people, or not as many as you would face in an individualist culture, the rate of return of the wallets was much lower, because returning a wallet is essentially helping a stranger you've never met and, you probably never will meet. So I think it was a really fascinating study. But yeah, like you said, it probably not a cheap one to run.
Yeah, but it's really tapping, again, back into human nature. What are we really like? And then how much that nature can get tweaked by cultural norms. We're such an aberration, Western civilization in human history, or, going all the way back 100,000 years. I had Joe Henrich on the podcast about his book, Weird, Western, educated, industrialized, democratic, and rich. No, rich and democratic, weird. And, that so much psychological research is based on, just those people, especially, 18 to 20-year-old undergraduates at elite universities. And we generalize, oh, well, this is what human nature is like. Well, that's harder to say.
That's great that you had Joe on, because actually that his research is really, really germane to this whole topic. And in particular, the work that he's been associated with much more recently, showing that the Western model, if you like, of society can, not everyone agrees with this, but I think it's a super interesting theory. But the idea is that the Western model of democracy is built on some bans on cousin marriage that were instantiated by the Western Church in the Middle Ages, that sort of broke up extended family groups because people were no longer allowed to marry within their extended family, and had this effect of essentially kickstarting this model of democracy that we have in the West, which is a very individualist model that is based on not family-based cooperation, but is based on impartial cooperation with strangers, essentially. And it's a very, very interesting idea. I'm very fascinated by the topic, actually.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see if any medievalists who study the development of the church in detail, how they receive that theory. I haven't followed up on any of that, but it is interesting. It also gets to this problem of spreading democracy, because we have this idea, well, democracy is great, so we should help other people get to become democracies. And all right, let's invade Iraq and we'll bring democracy to these people. Well, that didn't work out so well. And near as I can figure, it's because they're so tribal that the idea of this kind of large nationwide democratic process we think of as good doesn't work if you have these, very devoted and often in conflict tribes that don't care about, this kind of more national size group.
Yeah, I mean, it's the problem of exporting cultural norms and cultural practices that have evolved over so many centuries. I think it's not trivial, right? And I think that you're right that for some countries that are based more on kin and clan based cooperation, which is very characteristic of more collectivist societies, it isn't very easy to just supplant that with a completely different worldview of what you should care about and what morality is and what, that kind of thing. I think it's sort of, I guess, easy to say in hindsight now, but it looking back, it strikes you as very arrogant in some ways, doesn't it? That we ever thought that was a thing we could do.
Well, but I get the logic because I remember George W. Bush mentioned reading Nathan Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy, and this inspired his foreign policy. So I read that book, and it's a pretty good argument. He's arguing against people that say not everybody's ready for democracy around the world, because of this kind of clan tribalism thing. And his argument against that is that that's really not fair to the people that are victims in those societies, particularly women and people of color and minorities, gays, and so forth, because that's who gets the brunt of these kind of tribal conflicts and that circle the wagon, and we can't allow too much diversity within our group because we need that kind of solid coherence to keep our group together and so on. And that really democracy has been the best thing for women's rights, gay rights, animal rights, everything, all that. And so that's the logic behind it, which I totally support. But when you put literally boots on the ground and you go, okay, we're coming in, it's like, wait a minute. What happened to, self-autonomy, right? And, nations should be able to decide their own fate and so on. Again, that conflict arises.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, this is getting a little bit out of my area of expertise, but I think that the idea or the ideology is laudable, but I guess it is also putting these things into practice. There's a world of complexity in terms of how you go about doing it. And gosh, I am just not qualified to comment on that.
I want to ask you about, let's go back to the beginning of life itself. This idea of cooperation actually goes all the way back to the origins of life, right? Lynn Margulis famously, made this argument, I forget what it was called now, this kind of, argument for why we have, for example, a mitochondrial DNA. Why is there DNA inside the mitochondria, inside our cells that already have a nucleus with DNA? I mean, it's just like, what? And her argument was that, well, because those used to be individual organisms and they cooperated together to become larger, more complex organisms. So kind of walk us through, the origins of life all the way up to last week, this major steps in evolutionary history of cooperation and how that got us to where we are.
So this is sort of the structure that my book takes in a way. And in the introduction, I describe it a bit as thinking about it a bit like if you chop an onion in half and you look at all the layers of that onion, that's in a way how you can think about how cooperation has scaled up these different layers of complexity from the evolution of individuals or the evolution of cells even, all the way up to the evolution of nation states. And so if you start at that very, very central core of the onion, if we're thinking about the evolution of individuals, well, when we look in the mirror, what we see is a coherent entity. We see ourselves, I think I'm an individual, I think you're an individual, and you kind of, in some ways, I think a lot of us don't ever think any deeper than that. But of course, we're much more than that. We're actually collectives as well as individuals. And we're made of lots and lots of genes that are all working together inside our genome, and lots of cells that are all working together and doing different roles to make us. In some ways, I suppose to demystify it a little bit, you could think about how might your car look if you were to take all the component parts from which it's made and put them all out on the ground. There's a bunch of different things that go into making that car, that that higher level entity. And that's kind of the same thing that's going on in our bodies as well. And just like you said, we have these low level cooperation which occurs inside our cells, between the mitochondria and the genes in our nucleus. And in fact, we think that this very special kind of cell, which makes up every single cell in our body, and also the cells of all animals on Earth, originally arose because one cell type engulfed another one, ate it essentially. And instead of actually fully digesting it, it got a case of what you might think of as cellular indigestion. And this eukaryotic cell, this cell with a mitochondria, was born from that event. And it's quite surprising to me when we consider that our best evidence indicates that this cell, from which all the animals on Earth are made, and all plants as well, actually, this event which allowed that to happen only happened once in the entire history of evolution on Earth. And so I think Dawkins wrote about this very eloquently, about the improbability of our existence. And this is just one point in time in which, things could have gone a completely different way, and we wouldn't be sat here having this conversation now if that had been the case.
Yeah, so to the uninitiated, eukaryotic cells are the cells we're made out of. They have many organisms, and they have a little nucleus with DNA in it. Prokaryotic cells are much smaller, much simpler, and the idea is that this cooperative step in evolution of these tiny prokaryotic cells glomming together, then the argument would be they are out competing. Their genes are more likely to carry on versus the prokaryotic cells, and yet we still have prokaryotic cells. So it's not totally either or, but that there is an advantage to having that cooperative nature, even though none of the components have any idea this is what they're doing, right? I mean, we talk about it like they have foresight, but as you noted, they don't. Evolution doesn't know where it's going. Dan Dennett has a nice picture of these termite mounds in Australia that they look very much like the New York City skyline, right? And the termites are building these things based on the temperature or whatever. And each little termite, it has no idea that it lives in this high rise, right? And then his analogy is, all the neurons in our brains, they're just little individual cells just doing their thing. They have no idea that they're part of this massive, sentient, conscious, self-aware, whatever structure. And that goes a long way to explaining, how this cooperation, these steps in cooperation to multicellular organisms, and then, organisms with, organs inside, and all of a sudden you end up with something like us. No one planned this. There was no foresight. No one even knew it was happening. Nothing even knew it was happening.
Yeah, totally. And in fact, you can push that analogy one step further. This analogy of there doesn't have to be awareness of the benefits of cooperation for cooperation to be exhibited. And you can push that and to explain our own behavior, because a lot of the time we have very, very little introspective insight into the reason why we do things. And when I say why, I mean why from an evolutionary perspective. Such a behavior could have been favored by natural selection. And so sometimes this is kind of the source of the confusion over the title of books like The Selfish Gene, where people have often confused the idea that a gene is selfish with the idea that only selfish people have selfish genes, or a gene is knowingly selfish and it has, it's got this agency and it's trying to, it has some kind of psychological motive to screw the other genes over. And of course, that's not what the selfish gene means at all. And in fact, when we talk about even our own behavior, and often I get accused of, taking the altruism out of altruism by showing how things like giving to charity can be ultimately beneficial for the donor because it improves their reputation, or it improves how attractive they're perceived to be by other people and things like this. And I think often people get that there's a really, it's really easy to make a conceptual mistake there, that by saying that something can be explained by evolution and that a generous act can have benefits for the altruist as well as for the beneficiary, that we're saying that the reason people do those things is because they know they're going to benefit from them. Now, that might be the case sometimes, but that's definitely not what we're saying in all cases. And quite a lot of the time, just like the genes in our mitochondria and the cells in our body and things like that, quite a lot of the time, we are completely unaware of the evolutionary impetus for the behaviors that we exhibit. And evolution tricks us, actually. It tricks us into doing cooperative things and into feeling empathy for other people and for feeling great, having this really nice feeling that we call warm glow when we are able to help another person. And all those mechanisms are evolution's way of getting us to do something that is in our own long-term interest, and for us to be often completely unaware of that. It's, so I think that's the kind of nice way, in a way, to illustrate that point, that there can be this conceptual confusion in a way over what exactly are we saying when we say that when people cooperate, they can benefit from cooperating.
Yeah, Richard calls that reading a book by its title only. And he said I should have called it the cooperative gene. But again, the logic behind it is I want to be selfish. Let's just use this language. But I know you do too. And I know that you know that this is the way I feel. And I know that you know that you feel the same in this kind of meta way. Therefore, I have to be nice to you. Now, at this point, it still sounds to it like a theist who embraces divine command theory. You guys are still just operating on a kind of a game theory logic where you're manipulating each other, costly signaling, or you just want me to help you later. That's still a selfish, not truly moral. So here's the extra step I take to counter this kind of theist divine command argument, that I can't pretend to be a cooperative, altruistic, good group member, because you'll detect that I'm a phony, right? Because we know psychopaths lack a lot of empathy, or they have no empathy, but they're good at pretending to be empathetic. But in time, other group members and people that know them can see that they're faking, right? And then they get called out, or they get punished, or whatever. So my argument is that it's not enough to fake being a good person. You actually have to feel it deep inside. I really do care about you. So when I buy my spouse some flowers or whatever, yes, I could say, you could say, well, you're just doing it for your own selfish sake, because you want her to do something for you later. No, if I did it for those reasons, she would know. So I actually have to feel it inside. And that, to me, that's true morality. Tubi and Cosmides made this argument about friends. Friends, but part of the thing about being a friend is you do things because you really feel like you care about them and you want them to prosper. And they can tell that you feel it. Because if you faked it, you might be able to get away faking a couple times. But if you spend enough time with other people, you know who's kind of a phony and who's real. And that sort of cheater detection module that Tubi and Cosmides talk about. I think that there's that kind of arms race, but that in the end, that true cooperators, we could tell who the true because they feel it deep inside, right? So that's the basis of friendship and love, and to me, that's as good as a foundation for moral, moral sentiments, moral feelings, moral emotions. As good as if it came from on high, because the creator of the universe said this is right or wrong or whatever. Well, this is even better than that, right? I'm not doing it because of some potential punishment or reward in the next life. I'm doing it because I care now.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. And I would say that this psychological altruism, if that's what you want to call it, this truly felt desire to help others, I think is as natural a feeling to us as something like hunger or some other physiological emotion or state that we experience that serves a real evolutionary function. And to your point about we're good at, we're kind of always a bit suspicious and we're very good at detecting when we think people are doing things for the wrong reason. I think that's also really true because we have these brains that are able to understand that sometimes you do a nice thing and you get reputation benefits from doing it. So we know that can happen, and we also know enough of other people's minds to know that they know that can happen as well. And so it doesn't take a very big leap of logic to start to question when someone is doing something nice for someone else. Well, we do look under the hood. We do try to figure out what is the reason. Why are you doing that? What are your motives? And are your motives pure, or are your motives calculating? And are you doing, is the reason you're doing this for the right reason, or are you doing this because you know that you might benefit from this in the future? And we're very suspicious of acts of altruism that we think are tainted by self-interest. And there's one really nice example, actually, that was done. It came from an anthropologist called Richard Lee, who was working with Bushmen in the Kalahari for his research. And his whole research project was about studying subsistence methods. And so even though he had quite a lot of food for himself, he developed this reputation in the community in which he worked as being quite stingy because he wanted to study how their natural subsistence strategies. He didn't often share very much of the food that he had with the people that he was studying. Anyway, at Christmas, he decides he's going to, rectify this, and he's going to go to town and buy a big cow, and everyone will be happy because he's splashed out on this big cow and it will feed everybody. And when he brings it back to camp, to his surprise, actually, rather than being appreciated and thanked, he's ridiculed, and people are kind of saying, "Oh, that cow, it's just a bag of bones. I can't believe you've brought that for everybody to eat. If that's all there's going to be, then people will be fighting. And I guess maybe we could use the bones to make some soup, but it's not going to be good for much else." And so everyone's making these comments about this cow that he's bought, and he's starting to feel like maybe he should go and buy another cow because maybe the cow he bought isn't big enough or something. And finally, he sits down with one of his friends, one of the Bushmen, who tells him that actually the way he'd gone about doing this was entirely wrong, and that to give this gift with so ostentatiously, and to bring this gift in for everyone to see and say, "Look how I've brought this cow for you all," that wasn't the way to do it. And the way to do it was to be very modest, actually, and to say, "Oh, I've brought this thing, but it's not really, it probably won't be enough, but I see what you think," and to be very modest. And when he realized that, he sort of realized the extent of his faux pas in a way, and realized that actually that was how they also shared the meat that they caught. They didn't bring it into camp and say, "Look what I've caught here." They would leave it at the edge of camp and say, wait for someone to ask, "Have you caught anything today?" And then they'll say, "Not much, not really." And that's how, then you'd know, oh, they must have caught something pretty good, because they're just, they're playing it cool. And I think there's all these layers of inference, and we're always trying to decode, like, what's going on? Why are you doing this? What are your motives? And we do that all the time. We do it very effortlessly. And it goes to show, actually, that we are very sensitive to these motives, these perceived motives behind pro-social behavior.
Yeah, those norms are tricky. I was thinking of the billionaire pledge that a lot of the billionaires are taking now, kind of trying to push each other in that direction to make it like this would be a good thing to do, like get rid of 90% of your wealth before you die, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and so forth.
Yeah.
And now there's kind of a list. I think there's another Forbes list, so the Forbes 500, or the richest people in the world, that the people that have taken this pledge. So there you get benefits, although that could still be considered just pure egotism. I'm doing it so I could be on the list. We want them to actually want to do it. And, my sense about Gates is that he actually wants to make a difference. He's trying to, help public health and globally and things like that. But now with we just had Richard Branson just went into space, and Jeff Bezos is going this week. And, there's a lot of pushback against these guys because there's some recent revelations about their taxes, that they have legally avoided paying their fair share, so-called fair share. I mean, in some cases, nothing, right? Because the way these things are tax deferred and invested in properties and I don't know what. I have no idea. I can't even afford the attorneys and accountants that would help me do that if I had the billions, which I don't. So, but again, back to that psychology thing, if somebody puts their name on a building at a university, well, that's nice, but why'd they do it, right? But if it's like I paid for the telescope, or at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, there was a lot of industrialists that helped build these telescopes at the top of mountains. and they always had their names on it, right? And these telescopes are very phallic, and it's like, okay, come on, guys, why are you doing this, right? But on the other hand, if you're an astronomer and you got to get your money from somewhere, I don't blame that. But the deeper thing is, the motive behind it. So I like the effective altruism movement and people like Peter Singer that have set up these foundations that evaluate which charities are back to what you said before, the most effective.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to make donations and most of my money goes to payroll, salary, benefits, brick and mortar rent, the utilities. I want my money to go to little Endugu who needs money, right? So there's those.
Yeah. And that's actually those, I actually give to that as well. And they're very, I fully support that movement as well, but it's actually really interesting that when loads of how people prefer to give is geared towards ways of giving that are indicate something about our underlying pro-social motivation. For example, people generally think that donating time rather than money is a more morally superior thing to do, even though actually if you are a city banker or you're really earning mega money, the best thing you can do is basically just keep on working and give money to the charity. Don't give up one of your highly paid days at work to go and work in a soup kitchen, because you could do more good by just giving a day's salary essentially. And so I think the effective altruism movement is really, it's like super rational, but I think the difficulty with it is that it doesn't like psychologically click with a lot of people. It doesn't make them necessarily, I guess it's one of those things about how you frame the donation, because I think for a lot of people it doesn't tick their button, or it doesn't press their buttons about why they feel like they want to do this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's why I was like Peter Singer's thought experiment. If you're walking along a path and near a lake and you have on a pair of $500 boots, whatever, kangaroo skin or something, and and a little kid falls in the drink, would you sacrifice your $500 boots, jump in there, they're ruined, to save his life? Everybody, well, of course I would. All right, well, there's starving kids that are effectively drowning right now, and just take the $500 you were going to spend on the boots and donate it to this charity, right? And people are like, oh, yeah, maybe I'll do that, maybe I won't.
It's so strange, isn't it, how our minds work, though, because everyone probably feels that intuitive disconnect between, it's in the here and now versus, actually. But I think it comes back to that experiment in some ways that I was telling you about, with the responsibility and the idea that people who, when you feel responsible for an individual's welfare, you are more likely to take action to help them. And I suppose the imagery that you have when you're picturing yourself by that lake and the boots, and you're the one, and that the kid's there, and if you don't do it, no one else is going to do it. There's probably a bit of it is down to thinking, well, okay, I can see it in that scenario, but if it's not in that scenario, maybe you don't feel that same responsibility, or that it's all on you to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's right. I occasionally get asked to endorse some Patreon account, or some project, a documentary film on science, or books for kids, for example, and I only do it if I would support it myself. So I actually do $100 or $200 or whatever. And then the first time I did this, I posted on Twitter, here's a good cause. You should all, support this book for kids teaching science. And I gave $100. And then immediately I get pushback like, come on, Shermer, you're just doing this because you want to post on social media that you're a generous person. I thought, okay. So I can't say anything, right? But if I don't say anything, then I don't have the courage of my own convictions to get in there, or at least it doesn't look like it. And so anyway, it's just kind of a funny thing. There's that tension there.
There was actually a really interesting experiment that was done there's a fundraising platform in the UK called Just Giving. I don't know if you have anything like it in the US, but essentially people if they're going to run a marathon or they're going to do something like that, they're going to make one of these pages online, and that's how they will ask everybody in their social network to sponsor them and the money will go to charity. And so it's kind of like replacing the pen and paper sponsorship page that we used to have as kids. And the Just Giving company they've got loads and loads of data, and they wanted to try to make better use of the insights that they could generate from when people donated, when they helped. How could they get those pages to spread through social networks? How could they get donations to increase? And one of the interventions that they tried was to, when somebody has donated to their friend, what they knew is that if that person who's donated, the donor, if they share their donation on social media, hey, I've just donated to my friend who's running the marathon, they knew that on average that would bring in about an extra £5 per share on Facebook, as that it propagates through that individual social network, just like you were doing. You were, posting that thing on Twitter. But what they found is that people, when they gave this prompt to say, oh, thank you for donating to your friend, please share that you've done that on Facebook, people felt they didn't want to do it. They thought, oh, I don't want to just suddenly write, I've done this thing on Facebook, because people will think I'm boasting about it. So people didn't want to do it. And they tried a bunch of different interventions to see what would work, what could get people to donate or to share that they donated. So they tried a prompt, which was something like, you're an amazing person, share your donation. Didn't work at all. No one did it for that. They said something like, I can't remember the other prompt. There was another one that said, oh, share your friend's page. And the one that really got uptick from this series of interventions that they tried was saying, help your friend to raise more money by sharing the fact that you've donated on Facebook. And by just tweaking the kind of way that you should think about what you're doing, they found that they had a massive uptick in the number of people who were sharing the page. And in terms of the donations, I think that one change in the way they worded that resulted in about a 28% increase in donations in that year, in the number of donations that they got. And so it's really, these small things can make quite a big difference in terms of, and it's because we are so social and we're so acutely aware of what people are thinking, what they are thinking about us, how they will respond to what we're doing. And we do this all the time. And this is just one really nice example of where, trying to take that into consideration can have a really big effect.
Yeah, Robert Cialdini has his famous book called Influence, and he just did an updated version, and they had him on a couple months ago. And he sort of pioneered this research on how you phrase a particular question or statement to somebody, to what extent they will then respond with a yes or a no. You're trying to influence them, say, in sales or something like that. And one example he had was restaurants had a problem with people giving reservations to people, but then they don't show up. And so the restaurants lost business this way. So the restaurants then started this, telling people, let us know if you're going to cancel so that we can fill your spot. And this had a pretty dismal response. And then Robert said, okay, let's change it to a question. Would you please call us and let us know if you're canceling? And then you wait for them to say yes, because who's going to say no, right? But that little thing, like upped it, 50% or 75% responding. In a way, it's getting me to participate. And the fact that I've said it, I feel like, well, now I have to, because, I said I would, right?
Right. Yeah. It's a nice example of, getting people to, well, it's a commitment device, essentially, isn't it? You're getting people to commit to that they'll do something, and then you're more likely to follow through on that.
I wanted to ask you a technical question in evolutionary theory. I don't really have a dog in this fight, but I've followed it for decades.
Yikes.
And that is individual selection versus group selection. I have no idea. I forget where you come down.
I thought that was what was coming. Okay.
So, Ed Wilson famously wrote, in a group, selfish individuals beat altruistic individuals, but groups of altruistic individuals beat groups of selfish individuals. And, Steve Pinker wrote just a fantastic long article for edge.org. You can find it on there. If you just go edge.org, Pinker, group selection, you can read about this. But he points out, for example, that the evolutionary biologist George Williams said, a fleet herd of deer is really just a herd of fleet deer. And that we're kind of confusing the individual for the group, and that the target of selection is really the genes, which is the individual organism that carries the genes. Anyway, I just want to get your thoughts on that because cooperation is part of that. Do we need group selection to get the kind of cooperation we want, or does individual selection theory account for it?
So I think it's now basically really uncontroversial that selection acts at multiple levels, and in some senses we are collectives, and yet selection acts at at a higher level. We express adaptations at an individual level that are not born by the genes inside our body. They're emergent properties of our individual being. And in some cases, that some people have argued that it makes sense to think of groups of individuals as being units of selection. And I think that there are some cases where you can think of where a transition towards individuality, and that's basically what we're talking about here. We're talking about whether we're seeing transitions to individuality such that adaptations are born at a higher level of organization. And potentially the most convincing case for that happening on Earth is in the case of the eusocial insects. So things like the highly social ants and bees and termites, where essentially the properties of the component parts that you see, for example, the sterile workers, make no sense really unless you consider them as part of a higher level organism, which would be in this case the colony. And some people have argued that it makes sense to think of these, whether you call them a group of social insects or a superorganism, the colony. Some people think it makes sense to think of those colonies as being the new level of organization, the new individual. And I think there is some merit to that, although I think that the analogy isn't perfect, but I think that it's probably the closest we get in the natural world to seeing these transitions to new levels of organization. And there are just lots of lovely examples of how these highly social insect colonies function like coherent individuals. So one really obvious thing is that the queen in a colony like that is akin to the egg producing ovary in the body of an individual female. The workers are akin to all of the other somatic cells, the non-reproductive cells that make up the rest of your body and are actually not capable of passing their genes into the next generation directly, just like none of the cells in my body are capable of doing that either. The only route for the genes in my body into the next generation is via my sex cells. And there are some similarities there between a whole individual organism and a social insect colony. There are also lots of other lovely adaptations around things like infection control and temperature regulation of the colony and protection of the colony, and even cases where we see suicide, an altruistic form of suicide among some of the workers, just like some of the cells in our body sometimes commit suicide in the service of helping the other cells and the other, keeping the whole thing afloat. So there are lots and lots of nice analogies. There probably is still more conflict in social insect societies than we tend to see in normal individuals. And so it's not a perfect evolutionary transition, maybe. There's still more scope for conflict there. But when it comes to human groups, I really don't think that the notion of group level selection is tenable. And for the main reason that our societies are not comprised of individuals that are either clones or highly, highly related to one another. And there's just so much more scope for conflict within human societies that it doesn't really make sense to think of group level adaptations that evolve because they benefit the group. And that causality, like you were saying about the fleet herd of deer or the herd of fleet deer, which is it? Which is the thing we're interested in? Well, what we have to think about is when we see these adaptations, what are they for? Are they emergent properties that just arise, but they don't arise because of their effect on group level fitness? Or are they adaptations that arise because they actually increase the fitness of the group? And distinguishing that, I think that's only just started to come through in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, this kind of causal approach to understanding this multi-level selection problem, but I think it's really the people who are most associated with it are people like Samira Kasher, who has written lots and lots on multi-level selection from quite a technical, philosophical point of view. But I would recommend his stuff, definitely. And for me, I think the central point is that for group level adaptations to arise, what normally has to happen is that within group conflict has to be almost entirely suppressed. And I think in humans that there is just not that, we just don't live in groups like that. There is conflict. And so I am probably more of a traditional Dawkins advocate in some ways in that sense. But I don't dispute that there can be competition between groups and that can have effects on the individuals in the groups that they live in. I think that the whole field of cultural group selection is really interesting and is throwing up loads of really interesting hypotheses. But I'm not convinced that human groups are levels of selection in the traditional sense that we think about in, for our bodies, for example, for our individuals.
Here's how Pinker put it. Natural selection could legitimately apply to groups if they met certain conditions. The groups made copies of themselves by budding or fissioning. The descendant groups faithfully reproduced traits of the parent group, which cannot be reduced to the traits of their individual members, except for mutations that were blind to their costs and benefits to the group. And groups competed with one another for representation in a meta-population of groups. But everyone agrees that this is not what happens in so-called group selection. In every case I've seen, the three components that make natural selection so indispensable are absent. So I think I would agree with you on that. Again, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm not sure why evolutionary theorists are so passionate about this group selection thing. Maybe it's because when it's applied to humans, we have a sense that if we can develop better groups, then we're going to be a better species or something like this. And that gets into the kind of the politics of that problem. Because often religion is explained in this kind of group selection way. I should point out not just Ed Wilson, but David Sloan Wilson also is big on this. That something like religious rituals, the praying together, chanting, singing, holding hands, things like this, are a way of uniting a group to be more cooperative, to get more money. And there's research on this. David Brooks wrote a whole book about this, that religious people get more money, they donate more time to charities, they donate more blood, and so on. And of course, theists jumped all over this, saying, ha, you see, religion is better than secularism or something like this, or that belief in God. But then, when you deconstruct that, what does it mean to be religious? It's such a big word, because it turns out that non-believing, say, atheist spouses of a religious spouse, they get pulled along and they also make more donations, donate more time or whatever. It's more of a kind of social capital. I'm going along because, my whole group is, my family, my friends are all here in church. And yes, okay, I'm not a believer, but whatever. I want to support the team, that kind of thing. And so it's more of a social, psychological cooperation rather than religious.
I think one of the, one thing that I've worked on quite a bit, which has often been one of the contentious issues in this group selection, individual selection debate, has been the evolution of punishment. And so punishment in an evolutionary sense, we have a pretty strict kind of definition of what it is. And what it involves is a punisher paying a cost. So a punisher is incurring a cost to harm usually a cheating individual in the group. And then the benefits of the punishment, if the cheating individual reforms their behavior and is more cooperative in future, those benefits are shared by everybody in the group. So in some respects, punishment has also been held up as one of these evolutionary puzzles of how does this evolve? It's a bit like cooperation, and people have called it actually a second order social dilemma, because you've got another case where even though you're doing something harmful, you're punishing someone, you're paying a cost that is in principle or possibly producing a societal benefit. And so we have to ask how can this tendency to pay that cost, if you could just get away with sitting back and let somebody else do it, how could the tendency to pay the cost and be the punisher ever evolve? And there's one school of thought which says that the way that this can evolve is if we have group level competition, and if groups with punishers in them outperform groups that don't have punishers in them, because the groups with punishers tend to be more cooperative because everyone gets smashed if they don't punish, and the groups without punishers tend to be less cooperative because no one's making them do it, right? So that's kind of the group selection argument, which is that from an individual perspective, at least, the punishment is truly altruistic. Like the punisher really does take a hit for their group in a sense. Now, the research that I've done with my colleagues has shown that actually, even though punishers pay an initial cost, often they can expect to reap individual level benefits from these actions. And there are multiple ways that they can, in principle, benefit from punishing. So one way a punisher could benefit is that by punishing, you can send a signal to people that you can gain a reputation benefit. And the kind of reputation you get from investing in punishment will vary depending on the context. But one kind of reputation you can get is, don't mess with me, because I'm the kind of person that if you do something wrong, I tend to punish them. So when you interact with me, you better cooperate. So you can get a reputation for being formidable. In other cases, you can also get a reputation for being trustworthy or cooperative. For example, if you intervene to help a victim, even though you weren't necessarily harmed in that interaction, but you go out of your way to help someone who has been harmed, you might then benefit because you're deemed to be more trustworthy and people prefer to interact with you. And so we don't necessarily have to fall back on these group level selection arguments to explain how punishment could evolve inside groups, because we already have perfectly plausible ways that it can evolve that are entirely consistent with individual level selection and are consistent with individual level benefits. And so even for these puzzling behaviors of, like punishment, if we look for them, we can find ways that we can reconcile them with an individual perspective. And so there's just another kind of afterthought to your religion comment as well.
No, that's opens a whole nother area of discussion. Moralistic punishment is super vital for group cohesiveness. Because if there were too many cheaters and free riders, freeloaders, the groups would not be successful. Again, Christopher Bohm makes this point in his book on the origins of morality, that these hunter-gatherer bands that he has this database, which is amazing, of the kinds of punishments they impose on people that are free riders or cheaters, and especially bullies. These big motherfucker guys that just completely disrupt the groups. Just psychopaths. They're whatever you want to call them. Excuse my language, but that's kind of what they are. No group can tolerate this. We got to do something about this, right? So he shows all the steps they go through, gossiping and scolding them and so on. This doesn't work with bullies. So, the ultimate thing is capital punishment, right? They take the guy out on a hunt and they come back without him. And he also shows that it's actually hard to kill somebody without modern weapons, right? So it helps to have half a dozen of us that are gonna at my signal, we're all gonna jump this guy, and with the spears or whatever we have, clubs and whatnot. And it's hard to kill somebody who's big like that, especially if they're mean and bullies. And but it also diffuses responsibility for the murder. We all did it. We were all in on this. So you can't follow up with then revenge killing by the guy you killed, his family getting back at your family or whatever, because we were all in on it, that kind of thing. Anyway, I find that just super interesting.
This is actually super important. Yeah, that idea that punishment has to be consensual and carried out by a group of individuals is actually really super important, because obviously one massive cost of punishing is the potential for retaliation, or the punisher incurs a real potential physical cost of their actions if it's in the real world. And there's some lovely evidence from the Turkana, which is a society in rural Kenya, where men go on raids to neighboring groups with the aim of catching cattle and maybe women as well, and bringing them back to the home group. And some men get scared and they don't go. They kind of stay. They free ride essentially on the raiding party, and they don't help their raiding comrades. And when that happens, it falls to the same age peers of the individual who didn't go, the coward, let's call them. It falls to his same age peers to mete out a collective and pretty brutal punishment tie him to a tree and beat him up. And similar things happened in medieval England. It was called tithings. And if someone in the village or in the community did something wrong or was, needed to be taught some kind of lesson, it fell to the members of his tithe, his usually his same age peers. There would be a specific group of individuals, and it was on them to mete out that punishment. And by doing it in that group and by having it formally sanctioned in that way, it legitimizes the punishment to some extent, and it also massively reduces the scope for retaliation, because you can't, you can retaliate against one person, but maybe you can't retaliate against 8 or 9 of them. So
yeah, so this is called self-help justice. I think it was Donald Black who first set up a database of what is the motive behind most homicides, and it was something like 90% are moralistic in nature. Versus instrumental violence. So, I didn't kill him because I wanted to steal his Rolex or his car. And a lot of those were just kind of accidental because the guy fought back or whatever. Really, most of the homicides are moralistic. He insulted me in front of my girlfriend, or he slept with my wife, or she deserved it because she was unfaithful, or my business partner was stealing from me, so I killed him. In almost all cases, the perpetrator feels that the victim deserved it. In other words, it's kind of a capital punishment system where I am the judge, jury, and executioner in one fell swoop. And it's all justified. Roy Baumeister wrote that great book on evil, where he interviewed people in prison. These are serial killers, just killers, right? And to a man, and they're almost all men, the guy I killed deserved it. Here's what he did. You're not going to believe what this guy did. And this is what and anyway, then Richard Nisbett has that interesting research on the difference between people from northern states versus southern states. And so his argument is that democracy came later to the southern states than it did the New England states. And one of the things democracy does is it takes away self-help justice and says the state is going to do it. You're not responsible for correcting this error. We have courts. You hire a lawyer and you sue the guy or whatever, or the state will try you for your homicide. But because democracy came later in the South, and also there's some research about people that went to the South came from different areas in Europe. I think it was like more mountainous areas where you have to kind of have your own set of norms and standards. And it was harder for the state to reach into these more mountainous areas and have these norms of the state is going to take care of justice. And so the self-help justice develops. Anyway, so Nisbett had this just almost hilarious experiment where, subjects fill out this form and they're supposed to walk down the hallway and turn it into the person in the other. That's all fake. And on the way down the hallway, there's somebody sitting there, a shill, at a locker or something, and then bumps into them and says something like, asshole. And so then he then draws the blood of the people that got yelled at. And people from southern states, the testosterone was higher, their stress hormones went up. They responded, like, asshole, fuck you, right? Whereas students from northern states are like, oh, I'm so sorry. More apologetic about it. Anyway, so this is all, Steve Pinker talks about this in The Better Angels of Our Nature, that, this kind of long decline of violence in a way is the state eventually defanging people from their natural inclination. Everybody wants justice. And we're seeing this now with, post George Floyd. It's clear the African American community doesn't trust the justice system and law enforcement, and for good reason, right? There's enough bad things that have happened in the past. You talk about paranoia in your last chapter that I really wanted to get to because it's super interesting. I call this, in conspiracy theories, I call this constructive conspiracism. Enough conspiracies are true. People really do conspire to gain an illegal or immoral advantage over other people. This happens all the time, right? Enough that you really should be a little constructively paranoid because sometimes they really are out to get you, right? So I love that whole section in your book in terms of the kinds of things we're dealing with now.
Yeah, I mean, paranoia is a really interesting topic because I think for a long time, the assumption is that paranoia is an irrational thing, or it sort of goes hand in hand with this idea that it's unfounded. I mean, you almost kind of when you say paranoia, your immediate thought is, oh, people are paranoid, but that by definition, it means they're mistaken. But in fact, the perspective that you're advocating is one that I and my colleague that I work with this on, a guy called Vaughan Bell, very much share, which is that paranoia is a rational response to experiencing chronic social threat. And for some people, that response becomes dysregulated and it tips over into being a pathology, and it becomes something that, for a lot of people, they would want it to be treated, and it's a medical condition. And so we're not denying that for a minority of people, paranoia does become very, very problematic, and it is a dysregulated mechanism. But we are apes that have brains that are able to and designed to experience paranoia, and there's a good reason for that. That's a way of helping us to keep track of what's going on in the social world around us, to monitor what's happening, who's making an alliance with who, is this person a friend or a foe, where do I fit into this situation? Like all these kinds of social coalitional computations that we're doing very much feed into this capacity for paranoia. And what we find when we look at the kinds of environments people live in and the social threat that they're exposed to on a daily basis. So, for example, if you think of things like being low socioeconomic status, or having a history of being bullied or victimized, or being part of a marginalized ethnic minority group, all these things are reliable markers of social threat. They are concrete manifestations of the fact that you are exposed to social threat. And for people that are exposed to conditions like that throughout their life, or that live in conditions like that, tend to have a higher chance of developing a psychotic spectrum disorder in their life. That doesn't mean they definitely will, and psychosis, one of the key symptoms of psychosis, I should say, is paranoia. And so there's this link in a way between being exposed to social threat or coalitional threat and our psychological mechanisms that start to ramp up and take that threat seriously and start to be more wary about the social world that we find ourselves in. And we found that we can, if you think about paranoia in a way as being a bit like the volume dial on your radio, some people will have that dial set very, very low. They'll be on a 1 all the time. That's most people, actually. Most people are not very paranoid at all. Some people will have that dial set to like 2 or 3. They're kind of a bit suspicious, a bit mistrustful, but not very paranoid. Some people will have that dial, a very small minority of people will have that dial all the way cranked around to 10. And for those people, they tend to be people that are experiencing what we would call frank persecutory delusions, where they genuinely believe that people are conspiring against them, and some quite often quite bizarre beliefs will be associated with that extreme form of paranoia. But what we've shown in experiments is that if we expose people to very, very mild social threats, for example, if I do an experiment with you and you tell me you're a political conservative, and I say, okay, you're a conservative, and your partner in this experiment is a Democrat. So that's a very mild social stressor. It's just an in-group, out-group manipulation. What we find is that even the people that are on number 1, normally the volume 1, putting them in that situation will dial them up to, say, a 2 or a 3. So we all have this tendency or this ability to crank up our live paranoid thinking in the moment when we're exposed to social threat. And we find that people do that. They are more likely to think that the partner has harmful intentions towards them in that socially threatening situation, and then they'll dial back down again. For some people who are really suffering with a mental illness, they unfortunately find it difficult to turn that dial back down again. But this is a normal thing, and everyone can be capable of paranoia, and we've shown that it's elicited by social threat. And in some ways, you can think about this as being also really relevant to the political polarization that we discussed earlier. I mean, there was a paper that was published, I think, earlier this year, showing that when you ask people what they think about their about their political opponents. If you ask Democrats, what do you think about Republicans, and you ask Republicans, what do you think about Democrats, both sides think that the other party is more out to get them than the other party actually say they are. So both sides think the other party has more harmful intent towards them than the other side actually expresses. And I think that's like really interesting. It's like there's something in our brain that is like signaling off like this person is out to get me. And it's a safety mechanism in some ways, but it's not always, sometimes it's not always, quite right in that way.
Yeah, but there's a logic to it. I mean, if you're always a one, you're a potential sucker for scams. I get these calls all the time. Your mortgage is about to expire. Your car is going to be recalled, and so on. If you don't, and the IRS is after you. And I always just keep them on the line for as long as I can, just to screw with them. But but if I wasn't a little bit paranoid, I might think, oh my gosh, well, this guy has my best intention in mind, and I better send him my social security number or something. You're just a sucker, right? Fall for cults and things like that. So I would say, on your analogy, you should probably be a 2 or a 3 most of the time, because there are a lot of coalitional groups that don't care about me, or they want to exploit me. That's normal. That happens all the time. My next big book is on conspiracy theory, so I've been writing a lot about this.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, and I link it to the negativity bias. That say, for example, losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good in economic theory. But it applies everywhere. We have more words for negative emotions than positive emotions. And, we notice negative criticisms way more than positive ones. I mean, I can get like 100 positive responses to a tweet. And that one guy that said that thing, I'm like, who is this guy? I'm just zeroed in on the one negative thing, right? But that's totally normal, but for good reason, because if you look at human history, again, we're, largely hunter-gatherer groups are fairly poor. Somebody that got an advantage, it was really pulling ahead of everybody else. There's a probably good chance he didn't do that through pure meritocracy, right? There was some coalition going on, a little cheating. I'm not in on it. If you look at like the research on, wealth resentment, and income inequality is a big topic now. Why would anybody care how much money Jeff Bezos makes? It's no skin off my back. I use his company all the time. Well, because it doesn't feel right. And throughout most of human history, the wealthiest people, they probably did kind of cut corners. They cheated a little bit. They had these coalitions that got them unfair tax advantages, so-called crony capitalism, happens all the time. And conservatives are, they're allegedly pro-free market, but they're not. They're mostly crony capitalists, right? We want the benefits for us, those tax breaks for us, right? So for good reason, say Democrats, their dial is up to 4 or 5 when it comes to those Republicans, because they do those kinds of things. Right now, we're in the middle of this whole voting rights acts, laws being changed to prevent Democrats from voting, prevent people of color and so on, poor people from voting, by putting more obstacles in the way. It's so obvious why they're doing it. So of course I'm going to be, if I'm a Democrat, I'm going to go, you know what? I don't trust these guys. I really don't. They are trying to do something bad. And the truth is, they are. Right. So on both sides, I'm picking on conservatives at the moment, but
Right.
it goes both directions.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's a principle, you'll know obviously about this given your book content, but there's a principle in biology called the smoke alarm principle. And it's the idea that you can never know the world with certainty. So we always perceive the world with a degree of uncertainty. And that means that when you get a signal coming in, you can either act or not act based on the signal. So I'm going to tell you this story actually with a different example completely, but it still makes sense. I'm going to tell you to imagine that you're a meerkat. So if you're a meerkat, you live in the Kalahari Desert. You forage with your head down and your bum up. So you're digging sand. You can't see, all the things that are going to eat you are flying in the sky and you can't see those. All you can rely on is the other meerkat in your group that's on sentinel duty, who will give an alarm call if they see a predator. So you're digging, and you hear an alarm call. And you're just about to catch this scorpion or whatever it is. So what do? Do you abandon? Do you lose the food you were going to catch and then dash to the burrow to safety? Or do you continue trying to catch the thing you're going to catch. 90% of alarms are false alarms anyway. So why not just, ignore the alarm call and continue and don't lose lunch? So in that situation, there's uncertainty. You don't know if the alarm is real or fake. And there are two costs. One is you lose your lunch, and the other one is you lose your life. And in an evolutionary sense, we expect evolution to favor strategies that minimize the most costly error type. So we expect evolution to favor strategies that you always run to the burrow, even if 90% of the time it's the mistake. Because on the one time that it's the right thing to do, you haven't lost your life. And that logic, in a way, it explains that evolution, we shouldn't expect evolution to produce perfect behavior in every scenario that we see it. So if we stick with the meerkats, we expect them to make a lot of behavioral mistakes. We expect them to run away a lot when there was nothing to run away from. But on average, the strategy of, if I hear an alarm call, I always run away, is a good strategy because it minimizes the bigger error cost of losing your life. So potentially there's something there in helping us understand this paranoia and why maybe the dial does seem to be a bit tipped in the wrong direction, because maybe that is one way of evolution helping us to minimize the more costly error type of, trusting someone when you shouldn't have trusted them, even if you do make lots of behavioral mistakes in terms of being too paranoid when you shouldn't have been.
Yes, and the reason for this, again, is that there's so many more ways for things to go wrong than go right. Just in your body, there's just in interactions with the physical environment and other organisms who, would like to eat you or kill you or whatever. It's good to actually be pretty careful and cautious about how many ways things could go wrong. Anyway. Yeah, that's just, I think, again, part of our built-in nature. Okay, I just want two more things. Get your thoughts on why did it happen with humans, this cooperative system, and not chimps and bonobos and gorillas and gibbons and the all the great apes and monkeys and so on? Why us? And here I had Richard Wrangham on the show last year about the goodness paradox, I think was the title of his book. So he has this idea of self-domestication. We kind of domesticated ourselves for various reasons. But anyway, I just want to get your thoughts because you mentioned this. You talk a lot about insects and birds and so on, but why us among all the primates that didn't become, a global species?
Well, for starters, we are the only great ape that is what we call a cooperative breeder. And all that means is that we live in stable family groups where mothers can expect to receive assistance with raising offspring. And so in this respect, we're quite different to any of the other great apes, where the babies are mainly raised by the mother and they have very little input from any other family member and anyone else in the group, in fact. And part of the reason that we evolved this very sort of strange breeding system where we live in these extended family groups and everyone chips in to help raise offspring is that we evolved in much more difficult environments than our closest living relatives, our contemporary great ape species, currently live in. So if you think about the environment that a chimpanzee or a gorilla lives in, it's kind of like a giant salad bowl, and most of what they need to eat is just there around them, and it's not very difficult for them to find it. Humans evolved in much more difficult environments, much drier, food was much more patchily distributed. We had a much more calorie-rich diet because we have these big brains that need feeding and have very high energy demands. And so we had to work together. We needed to help one another to survive, and we needed help in the production of offspring as well. And that's something we have in common with other species that also eke out their existence in difficult habitats, like meerkats and mole rats that also live in these stable family groups. And I think part of what made us so cooperative can be found in that very, very early prehistory, way back to the evolution of our species and the other Homo species, not just Homo sapiens, of living in these difficult environments where cooperation was a prerequisite for survival. We just couldn't do it. We couldn't get by without one another.
Like Neanderthals in Northern Europe in the Ice Age.
Yeah, as well. I mean, I think that So if we think about why we're so different to the other primate species, there are a few primate species that breed cooperatively, but they're in the minority, and we're the only great ape. And I think that set us on a different path from the outset. So immediately we're more tolerant of one another. We're more tolerant in terms of social proximity. We had to learn very effectively how to collaborate, how to hunt, how to scavenge, how to also not just get the food we wanted, but also to avoid being munched by other things in the environment that probably thought we looked quite like lunch for them. So there were a bunch of sort of battles against nature, if you like, that we had to cooperate to be able to win. And I think at some point we became so successful that I can't remember whose terminology this is now. That's embarrassing, but I think it might be George Williams, but I don't want to say that in case I'm wrong. But there is this transition from where we go from basically being in battle against nature to suddenly the biggest threat actually to us becomes ourselves. So once we get to a certain point where we really have spread out across the globe and our population has grown, and we're effectively doing quite well in the battles against nature and kind of hunting and not being eaten and getting the food we need and all that, suddenly the biggest threat to our survival becomes actually other humans. And in that sense, we're also kind of in a unique position in some respects as well.
Yeah, I've long thought about that. Question of why the Neanderthals went extinct. Their brains are just as big as ours, maybe even a little bigger. It looks like they had language of some kind, made complex tools, and so on. It could be they just got outcompeted by us or just outbred by us by a tiny little percent. Who knows? Maybe they weren't quite as cooperative in social groups as Homo sapiens. I don't know. It's an interesting problem. You mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting question, but.
Yeah, go ahead. If you have a thought on that, I'd love to hear it.
I think it's very. Well, no, not. I mean, I was just going to say, I think it's so hard the remnants of cooperation. It's so hard to look for that in our fossil record, right? And so to speculate on that it's not really easy. But I mean, I think that there is that theory that, part of what made us so successful in competition with other humans, or other human species as well, is that we were just much more effective at cooperating.
Yeah, there are those fossilized Neanderthals whose injuries would have killed them, but their bones healed up, or their teeth are all gone, but they live long after losing their teeth. So the idea is that they must have had help, and their social group, whoever their family or immediate group, must have taken care of them. Anyway, it's hard to see because it's just fossils. But I want to get back to this idea of the family. I asked because I had this guest coming up who wrote this book on. It's called How the West Really Lost God. So this is on the question of the secularization thesis, that is, religion's in decline because of secular science and politics and so on. And anyway, it's an interesting side debate. But her argument is no, it's the decline of the family, the so-called natural family. She keeps referring. She's a conservative, so you can see where this is going. What is the natural family? And reading this, I kept thinking of Sarah Hrdy's book, Mother Nature, that, and then Hillary's book, It Takes a Village. When Hillary published that book, conservatives' heads exploded. It doesn't take a village. It only takes a family, a mother and a father, and so on. Give us your thoughts on, expand a little bit on what you were just saying about, to what extent, mothers get help from other than just the husband, the father of the child.
Right. So, I mean, we are what we call cooperative breeders. And what all that means is that mothers receive assistance in raising offspring. And just like in other cooperatively breeding species, human females are often receive help from fathers. It sounds like strange to say it like this, as if it's a sort of surprising thing. But remember, we're mammals, and we're in a group of species where more than 90%, the mother raises the offspring on her own. So we're already unusual in that the fathers have anything to do with it. And then we're unusual again because not only are mums and dads doing something, but there's also these other helpers running around, and they're usually the retained or older children, the older siblings, who in many contemporary forager societies and also ancestrally would have been really important helpers. They would have taken care of their younger siblings. There are lots of other important family members we have. I mean, we have these sterile worker morphs that we don't usually call them that, but we call them grandmothers, and they are a very, very important source of help and input into the survival of their grandchildren as well. And we live in these extended family groups where the way that humans manage to sort of resolve this trade-off between having very high quality offspring and also pumping them out in quite quick succession compared to something like a chimpanzee is because we can rely on all this help that we have at our disposal. And in some senses, I think that's where, for many of us that live in Western nuclear families, and we can tend to start thinking that this is the normal mode of existence and things like that, but it's not. I mean, the Western model is a massive outlier, both cross-culturally and if you think of the broad historical perspective of our species. Like, this is quite a strange way of existing for our species, to just have the two parents and young offspring, and often to have your offspring quite close together, so that even when the older one is usually not really old enough to help with the younger one, and we tend to have smaller families, so we don't really make use of this potential older sibling help that could be on offer. That's not, most people, that isn't how it works nowadays. But this is quite unusual, and I think for many of us, this sort of myth of the self-sufficient nuclear family, if you like, was laid bare by the COVID pandemic, because what we realized is the reason this model works is that we do have help in raising offspring, but we just outsource it to institutions, or if we're lucky to have them still, grandparents. But for most of us, we need those institutions. We need our nurseries and our nannies and our schools and all these places we send our children away to. That's how the Western nuclear family model has worked. And for a lot of us, that support net was completely ripped away during COVID. And for many parents, that was a really big struggle. And, I've even got one of my kids at home self-isolating now. So this week has been quite interesting from that perspective. So I think that too much of a focus on the Western model is a bit misleading, because it gives us this sense of like that we evolved in these sort of little atomized families of mums and dads, and it really overlooks the role of the extended family in the human story and just how important that extended family has been. Having said that, I would probably slightly push back against the narrative of the book that you mentioned, which is that all the societal ills can be blamed on the breaking up of the family in a way, because one of the lessons, and we talked about this earlier actually, but one of the insights from the work that's been done by Joe Henrich and colleagues about what shifts in this transition from this hyper-local circle of moral regard to having a more universalist, impartial norms of cooperation. One of the key routes to getting to, if you think this is a good thing to do, one of the key routes to getting to that Western model of democracy is to essentially demolish the family. And that's what the Western Church did. It demolished the family by prohibiting cousin marriage. And so I don't necessarily agree that that sort of like reinstating the clan or something like that will necessarily produce all the societal benefits that maybe people might think it would, because I think that it's quite complex. I think it's quite complicated, actually.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm just thinking, again, political debates here about the importance of the nuclear family that conservatives make. So why can't a single mom just go ahead and raise her kids in the way you described as it's happened evolutionarily? Well, because we don't live in that world. If you're a single mom and you have two jobs, well, and you don't have your parents or grandparents living nearby, what are you going to do? Well, just hire it done. Yeah, right. On the salary at working at McDonald's, it's like, okay, so that's a tricky political debate. All right, so the state should come in and help these single moms, food stamps, things like that. Yeah, well, then the conservatives say, well, then these women are marrying the state, right? And instead of the guy. And, here it then becomes supercharged politically because people feel like, well, we should help them. This is, of course, conservatives then say that's what church is for. That's what religion is for, to, take care of the poor and the needy. And then the liberals respond, it's not enough, and, we need more. Okay. So anyway, I'm just kind of, riffing off this, it is a hot button issue for sure. Yeah. Anyway,
I kind of think the state should help them because you're born into I think the state should help them actually, because I think you don't get to choose the cultural system that you're born into. And if you're born into a cultural system where the role of the extended family has been essentially sort of decimated, and you don't happen to have access to support networks and you to help you in raise offspring, then that I think then yes, you are married to the state in some ways, but not in a pejorative way. I think it's like that's the cultural system that you're born into, and there is an imperative to help people because it's not, you don't get to choose.
Yeah, there's a lot of luck involved in how lives turn out this way. I was going to ask you just tangentially. I wrote a book on called Heavens on Earth about attempts to achieve immortality scientifically, not just religiously, and I'm critical of all of them. But anyway, then that led me down to why do we have to die in the first place? Why can't our bodies just keep going, for hundreds of years? And so I think it comes down to the stuff you were just talking about. That why not just drop dead at say, I don't know how old you are, but just say once you hit menopause, you should just drop dead because you're done, right? Well, your kids may need you to the point where they're in their mid to late 20s so that they have kids. And then you should drop dead. Well, but maybe actually their kids, and then you could be a grandparent. But after grandparents, we don't really, by the time you get to great grandparents, there's enough structure in place to help, the two generations back to get to their kids to breeding age and so on. Is that your understanding of what why grandparents are useful, but maybe not after that? We don't, from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, so the evolution of lifespan is quite interesting because I think people often think that you die because your body breaks down and that's the reason why you die. But I think it's less well appreciated that actually the mechanisms that keep your body healthy are under selection. They're under the force of selection. And so your lifespan is actually under the force of selection as well. And then to put it in very simple terms, if evolution sees a use for you in terms of helping your genes to find their way into the next generation, it will keep you alive and or for species where that there is a way for them to help to get their genes into the next generation, they often have longer lifespans than you might otherwise expect. And human females are one of those curious cases where we switch off our reproduction by undergoing a physiological menopause at around the age of 50. And that's the same, in all modern populations, but also contemporary forager societies, historical slave populations living on plantations. Like this is a kind of pretty universal thing that isn't to do with access to modern medicine or anything like that. Females switch off their reproduction before they die, and we undergo this physiological transition called the menopause. But then we're kept alive beyond the period at which we could continue contributing to the gene pool through our own reproduction. And one of the reasons we're kept alive is that we can still help copies of our genes find their way into the next generation because we can help to raise our grandchildren. Now, one of the things that's come out in the last couple of years that's really interesting is that grandmothers are useful. So grandmothers do help their daughters primarily to have more children, and they increase the survival of the children that she has. But they're only useful up till a certain point. So they're basically useful for about the first 5 years of an infant's life. But beyond a certain point, the grandmother actually becomes more of a drain on resources in this kind of extended family units where this has been studied in historical populations. The presence of a grandmother is associated with actually reduced survival of the offspring in that family and not increased survival. So beyond a certain point, evolution actually, it's as if evolution selects for the grandmother to die at this point rather than to keep her alive. And so it's almost like there's an incentive, evolutionarily speaking, for her to have this longer lifespan to help in the early stages of her grandchildren's life. But beyond that point, she's actually more of a liability to them than she is a help. And at that point, that is when that ties in with the average lifespan for women.
Nichola, you are so interesting. I loved your book. I love your research. I'm going to read the final paragraph of your book. There is an almost fairy tale quality to the role of cooperation in the human story. If used well, it will deliver riches, but in the wrong hands or used in the wrong way, it will bring ruin. Cooperation has carried us this far in our journey, but if we don't find ways to be better at it, to scale it to the global problems we face, we risk becoming the victims of our own success. Whether this fairy tale has a happy ending is up to us. Oh man, that's a great final passage. So, wrap it up for us. Are you optimistic for the future of our species? Are you pessimistic? Are you hopeful? What are you?
I feel bad answering this question. I think I suppose you could call me a rational optimist, but I'm still I think there's still a pretty high chance that we cock it up. But I'm hopeful that we don't. I think the COVID pandemic hasn't really done much to encourage me that we're going to be very good at tackling the global problems that we face. I mean, the COVID pandemic it's here and now. It's a disease. We don't want to catch it. There's a massive economic incentive to dealing with it. Like it sort of had lots of features that should make it relatively easy to solve. And yet here we are nearly 2 years later, still basically messing around and not getting to grips with it. And when you think about things like anthropogenic climate change and some of the really gnarly global public goods problems that we face that are intrinsically just so much more difficult to solve, I just don't have that much. I just don't feel very encouraged by what has happened until now. But I don't know. I think, we have to try to remain optimistic. Otherwise, what's the point? And also, I think that I do have confidence in our young crop of scientists and activists and, the young people who the next generation, I think, hopefully will do something different, and hopefully it won't be too late for them to do that. And, I want to be a part of that too. I'm not saying it's on them to do it, but I guess the young generation do to some extent give you something to hope for.
Perfect place to end it. Nichola, thank you so much for coming on the show.